our speaker of today, he's someone. He's the founder of the Climate Change Capital. He's the chairman of the Overseas Development Institute. He's the advisor on the Climate Bonds Initiative. He's a member of the Green Investment Bank Commission. He played a major role in the COP26 and many more things, but maybe he can introduce himself and talk to you. And after that, you can ask questions, so think about that and you can get the mic. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. James Cameron. The floor is yours.
Thanks, well, thank you very much, Emil. And those explainers, I don't speak Dutch, but I should plug in. Okay, so it's very nice to be here. It's a really lovely thing to have an audience. And as I woke up this morning and checked into the news and saw all these interviews from Davos, from the World Economic Forum, where I used to go many times, many years, I really do feel like this is the place to be, rather than up a mountain with all those CEOs talking about the future of energy. And that's really the single simple message that I want to put before you today, which is that we are going to remake the energy system. And we're going to do that because we must. There's an imperative behind it, but we're also going to do it because it's going to be a better system. And it requires imagination and courage of conviction, an awful lot of investment, and a lot of technology that will need to be invented and designed and distributed and deployed. So in the time we have, and by the way, I'm very happy to be interrupted at any stage. If you've got questions or challenges, that's fine. We've got roughly 45 minutes or so. Someone will tell me if we've gone over time to deal with this issue. And we're going to do it in this way. I'll do a little introduction of myself, add some experience so you can see where my perspective comes from. We're going to have a look at the context that we are in, some hard facts, some uncomfortable things to look at. We're not going to look away from that, even though I'm resolutely optimistic about our capacity to make this change. I don't look away from the bad stuff, and we have real complexity here. So we'll do a bit on the context. Then we'll have a look at what happens when we, humans, are really under pressure. We can be very creative. In fact, creativity and constraint often go together. And that means that we're going to be in a creative phase of great innovation. I happen to believe that partly because of the interconnected crises that we are in, we are about to experience a kind of renaissance where the arts and the sciences and political processes are going to come under huge stress and are going to produce new ways of doing things. And then finally, having gone through a few examples of where I think one can deploy capital intelligently, the right kind of interventions, the right kind of strategic interventions in public policy, leaving enormous space for confronting risk with real opportunity for business development and entrepreneurship. I want you to leave with the idea that being open to the possibility of change, open to the idea that ideas might come from unusual places or alliances might have to be formed with people who you might not agree with, is probably the way we need to go, to be open to the possibility that this innovation, this great change, is going to come from unlikely places and people perhaps we don't normally get along with. Okay, so I've spent more than 30 years working on the climate change issue in a number of ways. I can't claim that I've found any particular answer to a highly complex question, but I've had a go from a number of angles. I'm a lawyer by training. I taught law as well as practiced law as a barrister in the UK. I'm an international lawyer by training, so I spent my graduate years and my first years as a teacher focusing on international law, international environmental law in particular, and along with a longtime friend and colleague, I wrote the first law review article on state responsibility for climate change. And I did that because I'd written a legal opinion for Greenpeace way back in late 1988. And in 1988, I didn't know anything about climate change, but I had done work for Greenpeace before on other issues. And actually, I delivered my my opinion to the first Greenpeace International office in Amsterdam, in Keizersgracht. No furniture, just sitting on the floor, giving my advice to sadly much missed Steve Sawyer, the executive director of Greenpeace. And essentially, I looked at the evidence. The evidence was strong in 1988. I looked at the law. There was a cause of action and state responsibility. But Greenpeace wanted to know, could you bring an action before the International Court of Justice against America for failure to act on climate change in 1988? And I took the view you could, but they wouldn't submit to the jurisdiction of the International Court here in The Hague. And the rest of us were also implicated. So why not negotiate an international treaty using the same arguments, same evidence, same legal arguments, different way of getting at the problem? And Greenpeace said, yeah, that makes sense to us. We'll campaign for that. So I used that. I wrote the law review article. I got together with some other people, sort of same age as you are now, and started something called the Center for International Environmental Law, still going in Washington. And we raised some money, grant money, foundation money, tiny amounts really, looking back. I don't know how we did it. And we imagined what an international agreement on climate change would look like. And then we wrote it down. Then, instead of having just an academic paper, we built a coalition of those countries most vulnerable to climate change and least able to respond. No political power, no economic power. All they had was the law, the theory that however small you are in the international system, you have a vote, you have a legal process you can appeal to. And that became the basis of a group called the Alliance of Small Island States, and we advocated for an international agreement on climate change. Really came together initially in November 1990, the Second World Climate Conference, and then, as you probably know, a series of negotiations, agreement in 1992 in Rio, another one in 97 in Kyoto, critical one in Paris in 2015, and now we're in the period between COP26 and COP27, and you immediately can tell it's taken a very long time. It's a long, laborious, complex, confounding, and difficult process, and necessary. And partly because that process is so long and so difficult and, frankly, sometimes depressing, I've always wanted to work with people who had an optimism bias, and you find that in entrepreneurs. And I suppose over the years I've started lots of organizations, Center for International Environmental Law being the first, but also always with others. You never do these things on your own. Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, which is now quite an important organization focusing on data into the financial services businesses. I started a business called Climate Change Capital, having never done a day's work in finance, but because I wanted an organization like that to exist. And we used finance to direct solutions to the climate change problem. I've done the same in law firms, at Baker & McKenzie, the big law firm. And now I have a portfolio of interests that range from academic work through small startups in digital energy, through advising boards of big companies, and I'm still, for my sins, still connected to the international legal process on climate, and I'm part of a group of advisors to the UK government called the Friends of COP26. Yes, of course.
Do I understand from that you kind of try and fill that valley of death between the good idea and it actually happening?
Yeah, in fact, it's one of the key things that motivate me, is that I like to be able to connect the world of ideas with the world of action. I'm interested in the spaces between disciplines. Yes, I have legal training, but I'm interested in the relationship between law and policy and finance and technology and innovation, business building. I have an affinity with small businesses. I don't thrive very much in big corporate enterprises, but I like the power that they've got, and I want to direct it. So if I have a chance to sit on a board, I sit on a board of a renewable energy investment business. It's a reasonable size. I advised GE for many years on its board, a huge business. I like the fact they've got levers to pull. And if they were to listen to me, they might pull them in a certain direction. I also like the fact that I might be able to introduce them to someone who they might see as opposition, because I know the person that leads Greenpeace. Or I've used, for example, I used to represent a lot of NGOs in court cases, often against companies like that. It's one of the benefits of being an independent barrister. You're not in any sense owned by your clients. You have independence of mind and practice.
Mr. Cameron, may I interrupt for just 1 second?
Oh, yes.
If you have a question, just raise your hand and you get the microphone. So
Good one.
you were very loud, so that's good. But,
yeah,
so
good.
you know.
Okay, good. Anyway, thank you for your question. All right, so context. What's happening right now? Well, we've got a series of interrelated, you know this, you're familiar with this, but I just wanted to draw it out. We have a series of interrelated security issues. Climate, energy, water, food, war. That they're all connected. And there's something fundamental about this vicious conflict in Europe at the moment that is one of those jolts to our thinking. It gives us permission in many ways to let go of orthodoxies. It's fundamentally altered Germany's view of defense. It's drawn in Finland and Sweden into NATO, probably. It's created a whole new framework for understanding energy security and made it an imperative to switch away from fossil fuels across the whole of the European economy and in other parts of the world. Those arguments existed before. There were good reasons to switch to clean energy before Ukraine. There are reasons that were wholly to do with climate. But if you combine these interlinked, multiplier, compounding risks, it produces a really strong imperative to act. And we are seeing signs of it. It's possible to imagine now a European energy system that has very little dependency on any fossil fuels within a sensible period of time, by which I mean a decade or 10 to 15 years. You can visualize that now. And once you can visualize it, it's much more likely to happen. But in the meantime, it's going to be really tough to deal with these interrelated security issues. I think at the moment, the food and water issues are going to be brutal. The fact that something like 50% of the world food program's grain comes from Ukraine and the borders with Russia and can't get out through the Black Sea to places like Egypt, where the next COP is going to be. I fear that we are going to have riots in the streets in North Africa and the Middle East. We've already got serious famine problems in East Africa. We've got complete meltdown in places like Sri Lanka and Yemen and Afghanistan. The food crisis is going to really grip. And so for those of us who are advocates about doing something about climate change and really wanting this energy transition to happen fast, you've got to confront those brute realities too. You've got to have answers that are immediate and effective for those countries that are really vulnerable to this kind of multiplier effect in risk. But equally, when you have those big jolts to a system and you have an imperative, you can do things you thought were not possible before. And fortunately, particularly in the area of renewable energy, we now know that we have technologies that can be deployed fast, at very low cost, which are clean, and can be got to meet people's everyday needs in a way that we could never imagine before. So I know it's a cliche, much used, but this notion of the connection between risk and opportunity is very real. And one of the messages I'm trying to get across to investor audiences is that we need to invest in order to reduce risk. The energy transition is actually a risk reduction strategy. It's also, of course, a massive opportunity for deployment of capital for reward. Right? Because these systems are coming and they are very attractive. Your generation, when you build this system, you will create a very, very much more robust and stable system for energy, multiple sources, and you have no supply chains that you have to worry about from fossil fuel countries that are unstable. You'll have light. You'll have natural systems that you can really understand how to deploy and use. And essentially, that's the next part of my proposition to you, is that these forces are coming together, the imperative and the opportunity, the risk and the scale of the space for deployment of capital coming together, and we are going to innovate fast. The learning curves on all these technologies in the clean energy economy are happening really fast, exponentially. Solar PV is the classic example, but it's also happening in batteries. And the place I want you to focus on is the convergence zone between them all. Renewables, storage, digital demand-side management, electric vehicles, the infrastructure for all of it that pulls it together. Somebody is going to get very wealthy controlling that space, but equally, we all need institutions to be very effective to make sure that transition is fair and just, because if it's not, it'll get resisted and it'll be harder to do fast. So the just transition alongside the energy transition is also a way of getting to where we need to be quicker. So guy in the front here, second row, needs a cube.
Yeah, so reacting on the just bit, recently the Dutch government has placed legislation that heat pumps are obligated to place when you want to exchange your gas-fired boiler. Do you agree with that legislation from a lawyer standpoint of view? Because on the one hand you would say it stimulates sustainable energy. On the other hand, you put the bill in the hands of the people, which they might not be able to carry.
Yeah, it's a good example because we know that heat pumps across an economy would make a major difference to the way energy is consumed. We know also that there is a capital cost associated with that. In fact, a lot of this transition has the same shape. High capital cost, low operating cost. Who's going to fund the high capital cost part? Public money, private money, consumer, what combination is fair and what combination is effective? It's actually a good nudge into one of the points I wanted to make further down, but I will do it now. I'm really interested, there's a great project at Oxford that I've been involved with that looks at strategic innovation points or sensitive intervention. We've got a systems problem. You need systems analysis to think about how to fix it. It means there are several points in the system you need to aim at accurately in order to change it. And sometimes it needs money, sometimes it needs an idea, sometimes it needs politics. It certainly needs power of some kind or another to shift a system. But you've got to be accurate with it, otherwise you have unintended consequences or you have consequences which hurt and slow you up. So if there was a public reaction to that idea, which might be technologically sound and economically rational, but socially it's difficult to accept, that'll slow you up in the transition. You've got to take people with you. Now, the political economy of places is different. Hard for me to judge what would actually work to deal with that conflict that you raised there. But I also know, and we were discussing this earlier, that the big shifts we need to make can't be done exclusively on rational argument. It's not enough to know the facts. It's not enough to do cost-benefit analysis. We don't build cathedrals on cost-benefit analysis. We aren't going to build the energy system of the future on cost-benefit. Much of what we've learned so far that works has been because someone has had the guts to say, we're going to do this. That someone might be in government, or it might be an entrepreneur, or it might be a social organization, but conviction counts too. And many of the devices that we have for changing the direction of flow of capital require boldness, conviction, but accuracy as well. So let me give you an example that lots of you will be aware of. If you want to reward reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, if you want to reward innovation that saves carbon or values carbon, obviously one of the things you do with your public policy is you price carbon. You send a message across the economy that carbon has a value. It's a value so you save it, has a value so you create the means by which you reduce emissions. Economic theory is really clear about that, and most economists are very strong advocates for having some kind of price for carbon. And we have it in Europe with the EU emissions trading system. But we also know that for some economies, it's really difficult to set a whole of economy price. What is the right price? Would it be fair? Who's going to carry the burden? And what we've learned is that if you aim accurately, you can get a lot of the effect of a carbon price just by, say, focusing on upstream oil and gas. If you put a relatively low carbon price in there, you have a very significant effect. But you need, again, to place that intervention in the right political and economic context, and you have to have some courage of conviction that you need to make this transition, okay? All right, so we are innovating, we're bringing these technologies together, we can start to visualize a new system, but we also have to figure out how to get this into pretty much all sectors. So we need to figure out how the energy system and the food system connect, and how we manage our waste more efficiently, and how we do industrial processes differently. How do we make the key materials that we depend upon for the transition? We'll still need an awful lot of metals and minerals and other substances that have to be made physically. How much can we use hydrogen in that process? Could we also be bringing some technologies that have been on the periphery, like nuclear power, into a system, but not the same system as before, a more distributed system? Could we use small-scale nuclear in order to make hydrogen and industrial heat, rather than vast, expensive power stations pushing power around a grid? What do we need to do to reform the regulation of a grid, as well as the technical capacity of a grid to cope with multiple sources? I chaired a small digital energy business that can connect supply and demand, producing renewable energy on a roof, store it in a block of flats. We did a test in a block of flats in a housing estate in Hackney in London, where we had solar PV, storage, this control box that managed to match supply and demand in real time. So you put the washing machine on, it ordered up the power from the solar panels, and we distributed it around 50 different apartments. No utility. No utility. That technology exists today, but the regulatory environment doesn't allow it. It's not possible. There's no business there until that regulatory change happens. But we know it's possible. That's an innovation that's coming from the digital economy. We have phenomenal data now. We can visualize the world in real time. We've got low orbit satellites tracking and measuring everything in a slightly scary way sometimes. Measuring the world in 3-meter resolutions is sometimes a bit unnerving, but we can see what's going on to our natural systems. We can follow flows. We can see emissions. We can track methane from satellites. We have more knowledge, more ability to devise metrics. The ESG world is now open to loads of new types of data. We're asking different questions. We're expecting investors to know different types of risk. You have to do scenario planning if you're in a bank now, based on climate risk. Otherwise, you don't get your license to do your business. These are fundamental shifts in the way we do important things in our economy. Yep. Time.
Please finish your sentence, but after that, it's time for the questions for students. So think about a question. Please finish.
So, as I pull this to a conclusion with the point that I really wanted to leave you with, we are going to make this transition. It's an exciting transition. It's full of battles that have to be won against intransigence, lazy thinking, orthodoxies that can be moved out the way. But there's no real scope for despair here. We can really do this, but you're going to have to open up your minds to the possibility that solutions will come from all sorts of different places. They'll come from different economies, different parts of the world. You'll have to build alliances with people who you might feel uncomfortable with. We're going to have to cooperate like never before. For humanity to survive and to prosper, we're going to have to get really good at cooperation. We're going to have to build alliances that provide bigger marketplaces, more efficient ways of distributing capital, and we're going to have to find ways of aligning our interests across borders with different types of people in order to get this problem solved in the time that we've got. We've got that time. It's possible. We can feel quite energized about that, but it requires a really high level of commitment from the innovators and those who are capable of building these, constructing these new relationships to make the change good. And then we'll leave it there. Yeah.
Yeah, you definitely may applaud that. I can imagine any of you have a question, or else I will ask the first one. No, there you are. There you go.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your inspiring and very interesting speech. I had a question, especially considering your international and legal background, how you would feel towards big corporates, but also organizations in more economically developed countries, in aiding, for example, less economically developed countries, since they could have less resources to make more sustainable solutions?
Yeah. Very good question. So there are many ways into the answer to that. I spent most of my career on the international legal front representing those sorts of countries, the small island states being the obvious example, but also other countries that were most vulnerable to climate change. And when I started doing work principally advising the presidencies of these processes, it was with countries like Peru and Morocco and Fiji before we got to the UK. Okay. Now, one of the main reasons for choosing to do that, apart from a sense of fairness and justice that I have, is because the most vulnerable are actually our best advocates. So what's in the interest of the small island states is actually our interest. They're just ahead of us. They feel the vulnerability more than we do. They're more at risk. They feel that risk. They are in need of assistance because they can't do it themselves, but they're telling us exactly the right messages. So we can't fix the climate change problem here in the Netherlands ourselves. Neither can the United States of America. Right? No one can do it on their own. You have to build something collaborative. But the most vulnerable know that, argue for it, and they need listening to. The next way in is that, and I often say this to investors, particularly institutional investors. There are some big ones here in the Netherlands, some of the biggest in the world. My message to them is, you may have a really great climate mission now, a statement, you might have put money in specialist funds, you might be requiring ESG from your big funds, but unless you move money into the emerging economies, particularly those that are rapidly industrializing, who have got to switch away from probably resources they've got themselves, coal in particular, unless you're putting money in those economies, you're really not making a difference. So the answer you get is, but the risk, political risk, currency risk, technology risk, I don't normally do that, not good enough. Figure it out. Work with governments, work with development banks, work with those countries. Often the risk is mispriced. Investing in many developing countries is not nearly as risky as people think. Rather like the argument about investing in poor people. Oh, high risk, better have a high rate. Right? Not true. Many of the places where lending has been directed to the most vulnerable, often the women in the family, responsible, they pay back their money. There's a little example from my own experience of a solar company in East Africa that I've been a part of, which has a solar system which you rent for 2 years and then you own. People said, oh, you can't do that. These are very, very poor people. They can't afford to buy solar systems. We need to give it to them. Well, no, actually. Very, very poor people who have no access to energy will commit resources. And when they own that asset, they own an asset for which they can also generate revenue, and they can, if they want to, they can borrow to put things in a small business, for example. These are breakthrough ideas that require real focus and attention. Otherwise, we can't get to grips with the climate problem. We have to move a lot of money into precisely those countries that are in need for our benefit.
And we come to talk about that later on today, so that I'm just going to bring it to you, because or else I'm going to break things. There you go.
What's your take on hydrogen for the energy transition?
So one of the things that's very attractive about the hydrogen story is it helps larger companies and those who are already have management teams and a workforce that's used to doing big projects feel like that's the thing they can transition to. Equally, that's one of the problems with the hydrogen story, is it excites the oil and gas companies because they think we can do that. And it gives them a pathway out of oil and gas into something else. I quite like the tension between those two propositions. It's really, the point I made earlier about investing in emerging economies, you take a situation like India, who wins the energy battle in India matters to us a lot here. Right? You have to see a pathway to beat coal in India. The same in Indonesia, the same in South Africa. We allocated, the COP26 presidency negotiated a very large payment to South Africa to help them the transition away from coal. Hydrogen is one of the ways you do that. So India has put a huge bet on green hydrogen. They take the view that they can switch out of a fossil fuel-based economy. They're heavily dependent upon the importation of fossil fuels. It's a big chunk of their budget every year is allocated to importing fossil fuels. But they've made a massive commitment. I'm going to forget the exact number, but it's mind-bendingly big gigawatts of hydrogen they've committed to, just as they've done the same with solar. So they want to bring together renewable generation and hydrogen. The other good thing about going down that pathway is you can start to think very hard about other chemical solutions that might be out there. For example, ammonia looks really interesting for shipping. Ammonia looks like it could be one of the best transporters of energy. You can imagine, for example, a very large solar array somewhere in the deserts of North Africa or India itself, where you have an electrolyzer attached to some other big need for power, but also to make ammonia for shipping to move goods around the world. These are the sort of big industrial convergences that I see happening, but they need to happen all around the world. And one of the great benefits of having renewable energy as your source is you're not limited to where you are in the world. You could put a solar array and an electrolyzer pretty much anywhere, and it could be a massive importance. I also like the idea, it's unusual and slightly controversial, of using small-scale nuclear with alternative fuels that can't be used for nuclear proliferation to make hydrogen in smaller units within industrial parks, because I think it could be very handy. So it's definitely one of the pathways, but you have to look, I quite like the idea of someone competing with the energy majors there, so it's not all in their hands, and it might well come from an unlikely place in the world where the technology is really needed.
I think you were first. Some more, we have about 10 minutes for some more questions. Here you go.
Thank you. You said that collaboration is indeed the key for energy transition, and we have seen in the offshore wind sector in UK and Denmark that collaboration has put them on the top of the offshore wind capacity. Yeah. But what do you think that what force is stopping them generally in Europe that is forcing them not to collaborate? Is it what is the resistance for the collaboration? And do you think that companies with more knowledge and more size are more reluctant toward the collaboration?
So one of the companies I work with is a company in the UK called Octopus. And I'm on one of the Octopus boards investing in renewable energy. And we've just made an investment, quite an unusual investment for us because it's quite early stage, in floating offshore wind. It's actually an Irish company. And I'm really very excited about floating offshore wind. But one of the things that makes all of the offshore wind investments more valuable is if there's sufficient coordination of policy to enable you to connect to a grid that is literally interconnected so that you can move power to where it's needed across a continent. And there's always been a kind of big dream in the minds of those who've worked on energy policy in Europe that we would have a proper pan-European grid where, at any one time, there's the possibility of generating renewable power somewhere on the continent of Europe and you can move it to where it's needed. And as you will be aware, there's been a lot of criticism of renewables from people who either don't know or have political reasons for getting in the way that, oh, well, you'll never have much of the system because it's intermittent and all these ridiculous, the sun only shines during the day and the wind doesn't blow all the time. Yeah, we actually do know that. But a system that could be created that's got real scale where you can generate power in different parts of Europe and move it would obviously be ideal. What's in the way? Politics. The inability to organize. The European Union was very, very slow to take on energy as a subject area. The energy was always put in another box. There's a tendency to think of energy in a kind of sovereignty sense, my energy versus your energy. And that's a danger with this conflict that's emerging now, that people lose the will to do things collaboratively across borders because they feel insecure and they draw in. The other thing is that sometimes big corporations, particularly if they are connected to a flow of capital that expects dividend returns at a certain period of time, are nervous about making any big changes to the way they generate their income today. And there are competition issues. Collaboration between companies is often difficult to get through competition law rules, antitrust in the States. But ultimately, you do want to open up a larger space for the distribution of power. And offshore wind, we know now, is highly efficient ways of generating electrons, lower cost now. Most of the auctions that are being done, including here, are driving prices so low we couldn't believe it. When we were building the Green Investment Bank in the UK, we picked offshore wind as one of the areas that needed an institution, a public bank like that, to incentivize the growth of the market and to be one of the people who pulled in the private capital to do this. I mean, the prices that we were talking about then are just, it's just completely different. In 10 years, it's absolutely switched. Now renewables don't need subsidies, and they're producing electrons cheaper than any of the fossil fuels. And this is something you probably already know, but it's worth repeating. Fossil fuels will never, ever compete ever again on cost with renewables anywhere in the world. Clean energy will beat dirty on cost everywhere in the world. The economic arguments are won, but the political arguments are still there, and it's difficult to organize, and the existing system isn't designed around renewables yet.
Room for one or two questions. I just saw a hand right here in the front. There you go.
Yes. Again, thank you very much for the inspiring story. I think this question is a little bit elaborating on what you're just finishing with the last question. So in the last couple of years, we've seen a race of investment flows towards these green projects. What's your thought on the effect of capitalism against the effect of government policy making?
Okay, good point. Very good point. So when I was trying to emphasize the strategic intervention points, some of those intervention points are expressly policy intervention points. Incentives. A price for carbon is an incentive. A renewable energy standard. You probably know this phrase, contract for differences. If you have a long-term contract which the government underwrites, it makes it easier to deploy large amounts of capital, and you can financially model the return over a longer period of time. And there's a conversation going on in Europe right now, which I think is coming to a conclusion about having a contract for differences in hydrogen to encourage the development of the market. You can have other interventions like an advanced market commitment, where private capital and government align, say, if you can produce whatever it is, this particular good or service at this price, we will buy. Procurement is another way governments can influence the shape of a market by saying we will only buy that which meets this certain standard. And that could include energy. So I don't really want to make a clear distinction between the two types of intervention because they clearly go together, and energy is a heavily regulated market. One of the reasons why innovation in energy is tough and why technologies sometimes don't break through is because the incumbents, those who are already in the system, have strength, and part of that strength is the system has been designed around their technology, not the new technology. And they don't want to let go of that position. regulated marketplaces can only be changed through regulation. If you have inertia, and inertia is a really powerful force in society, you can't move inertia without power. That's both physics and politics. So, in a sense, the answer to your question is that politics really matters. Who's making public policy really matters. Who's informing public policy really matters. And if you can get an alignment of interest between those who've got the money, who are interested in change, the technologies that represent the change, and government, then you'll reshape the market. The incumbents will move, they'll have to adapt, or they'll die, or they'll hedge. I mean, you could argue that the shift between high and low carbon is the biggest economic hedge in history. If you're a producer nation, Saudi Arabia would be a classic example. What should Saudi Arabia do? It should invest excess profits from high carbon in low carbon. It's got the technology, Saudi Arabia's got a perfect place to use renewable energy. It's got a big construction industry. It's got massive capital resources. And in 20, 30 years' time, at the current rate, it'll probably be importing fossil fuels. So that's a natural hedge, high to low. All producer nations have that, so do companies. But if you want to make the shift happen, find the right intervention point and line up policy, finance, technology, and then you'll move faster.
Can we do one more question, or do we have? No, I'm very sorry. We're on a very strict schedule, but Mr. Cameron will be here at a break for 10 minutes, so please look him up after that. Ladies and gentlemen, James Cameron. I just want to know one thing. Who here in this room has experienced a bit of a climate depression, honestly? And who here is a bit more optimistic after this speech? There you go. Look at that. So that's something. Okay, so Mr. Cameron will be here for another 10 minutes. He needs to catch a train in Rotterdam. So if you have a question, and you go first right there, please ask him. Have a coffee, a little break, and after that, the workshops will start. You will hear a gong when it starts. And have fun, and we'll see each other soon.